our next and last speaker for today. It's Ville Paananen. And while he's also an SV, in his spare time, he's also a doctoral student at the University of Oulu in Finland. And while you all feel probably safe at the moment to have a little more space in between, he knows more about space and feelings, and he's going to present that now. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, day, afternoon, whatever, wherever you happen to be. I'm presenting our paper, Investigating Human Scale Spatial Experience. I'm Ville Paananen, like you mentioned, a doctoral student at the University of Oulu in Center for Ubiquitous Computing, also a bachelor student in architecture in Oulu School of Architecture. My colleagues Jonas, Jorge, Danula, and Simo were also big part in achieving this article. So first, let's define what we mean by spatial experience. In this paper, we use it as a sort of umbrella term for different kinds of experiences that are happening in a given space. So that's a bit of a circular way to define it, but it serves as the context for interaction. So space is now the lens through which we understand interactions. And then the human scale refers to the Danish architects and urban designers concept of understanding spaces through the sort of the first point of view, the eye level, so the pedestrian way of understanding how we are in spaces, whether indoor or outdoor. So why should HCI really care about spatial experience? Well, naturally, HCI is interested in humans, and humans are, by definition, spatial creatures. Otto Bollnow in the 60s stated quite well that the space belongs to humanity like a limb. So that's really expressive of the sort of magnitude or what we are talking about here. Another way to put it is fish don't know what is water. That's a good analogy in my mind for thinking about space. So we don't really think about space when we are experiencing it. And in the same way as you can't remove culture, you can't remove spatial experience for persons when thinking about persons' experiences. And you can find examples of these different kinds of spatial experiences quite easily. For example, even this conference now takes place in one place here, but also in several places wherever people are joining the broadcast from. And there's still a challenge as smart cities, ubiquitous technologies, and sort of these techno-futuristic visions are shaping our environments. There's a risk that HCI sort of forgets the human spatial experience and how the technology is still dependent on spatial experience. So to start understanding the spatial experience as a subject in interaction design, HCI, and so on, we ran first a questionnaire study on what affects or what spatial features relevant for spatial experience. So we used a crowdsourcing platform, Prolific, mainly targeted towards research purposes. And we had 4 questionnaire items on how people understand spatial experience and what they find are important about it, and how much they pay attention to spatial experience and their built environment. We gained 102 responses, and using thematic analysis following the guidelines by Broad and Clark, we formed these, I think, 23 spatial features, which have sort of different qualities about the way we experience places. And then we formulated these into 3 sort of themes. So first up, the subjective presence relates to the so the first point of view, the perceptual, the historical and cultural way we understand spaces. And next up, we have the structural aspects, which are related to the physical environment, the lights and textures and materials and the colors of the environment. And then lastly, active involvement. So it refers to the way we move in a space and how we navigate and how we are social and how we interact with people or our environment with. And then we wanted to dig a bit deeper how these different features are sort of linked with each other. So we ran another questionnaire where we asked the participants, 101 participants, to rate these different features. So you can see safety was found to be the most important spatial feature for the spatial experience. And then using the 3 themes I described earlier, you can see the subjective presence category is sort of the most relevant here. Now, we want to have an even deeper understanding on what these spatial features are, what sort of aspects they are affected by. So we gain this sort of a vertical slice of this spatial experience. So we focused on the most important spatial feature, which is safety. And we ran field interviews on safety. So we wanted to understand how the participants experienced safety. We used standard questionnaires and also like open-ended interview questions. And then we had a design speculation task for different safety technologies. So how could their safety be improved using different kinds of technologies? We conducted the interviews in few different locations and also at day and during the night. So we thought this also gives like a further understanding how you experience safety. And then quantitatively, of course, as we had only 18 participants, there's no meaningful statistical findings that can be made. But overall, our participants found the space is quite safe. Well, this isn't a big finding really. And in the EU report from 2015, the city was found quite safe as well. But we were, this sort of like builds that point that we want to understand what qualitatively affects safety, right? So this in turn now we gain what we call spatial understanding. So what you see here is the sort of the vertical slice I mentioned earlier. So we have the spatial experience, which we understood as a set of features of different like safety, people, comfort, and so on. And now by the field interviews, we found presence of other security personnel, alcohol and drug use, COVID-19, and contacting other people as being factors for person safety. So this kind of scope sort of highlights the range of these different experiences you can have of spatial experiences. But there's also a risk of having a too reductionistic view of this. Probably something more networked understanding is relevant. But it's a question, conversation starter, and it emphasizes that qualitative approaches should be used for understanding spatial experience. Then in our design speculations, we found 4 things. The participants valued physiological and psychological measurement. So they understood that safety is an embodied experience, right? And then they found value in assessing their environment. So in other words, they found value in augmenting your perception. well, today's keynote actually talked about that, augmenting your perceptual system. So there's some similarities there. And third, they found value in communication devices. So being able to contact someone when you are maybe in a danger or otherwise in a situation where you wouldn't want to be. So this is sort of an extension of your physical spatiality. You can bring someone into your own space. And lastly, they found value in self-adjustment tools. So you could maybe have a technology that can sort of guide you towards better mindsets. And lastly, we formulated 4 guidelines for developing spatial technologies. So first, account for varying subjective experiences. Second, acknowledge different dimensions of spatiality. Third, facilitate diversity. And fourth, support human safety, autonomy, and privacy. So to conclude, I presented the paper investigating human scale spatial experience, where we emphasize the role of spatial experiences in HCI, and we developed an understanding on spatial features. Then we focused on safety as the most important spatial feature and introduced guidelines for designing spatial technologies. And lastly, I would urge you to consider throughout the rest of the conference in what ways do these interesting research projects use spatial experience? In what ways do these technologies are affected by, or how does spatial experience affect these technologies? So I suggest there's something you can think about that for the future presentations in this conference. But with that said, I thank you for your attention and would love to have any feedback or questions.
All right, thank you for the presentation. And it reminded me of online meetings in Mozilla Hubs, where some people might sit at home in their own safe room and sit in front of the computer, maybe half a meter away, and the other persons are in VR, fully immersed in a fantastical environment and see sizes of the other participants and distances. So how does that affect what you just told us?
Well, I think spatial experience, for example, in that case, for virtual reality, it depends highly on the implementation, right? So the ways in which virtual reality affects your sort of perceptual understanding of the world, it depends on the quality, on how much it affects the spatial experience. So it's a sort of difficult to answer since, and there's a lot of VR research being done on these subjects. This is sort of growing interest definitely in the field, but in the context of this paper and also in my own research, I'm mostly focused on sort of these real environments cases. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Are there any other questions?
I really like this work, and I think if I'm thinking about space, I was a bit surprised that the first thing that comes to mind, and actually a bit sad, that people are first of all concerned about their safety, which I find in some way a bit pessimistic. Because well, could you maybe explain how you introduced the concept of space in that survey? Because maybe space can have very different meanings. So was it generally framed as a public space, an urban space, or because I think that probably has an influence on the role and the priority of safety.
Yeah, definitely. So in the survey, we first asked, how do you understand the phrase spatial experience? So it's sort of like an open-ended question. And then afterwards, we gave a sort of a further description, like you can think about spaces you inhabit in different times of day and so on. Like we didn't explicitly say that to consider public spaces or different kinds of like spaces. But there's definitely a you think about these spaces in different ways. When I'm thinking about the office, I'm not maybe thinking about safety, but when I'm thinking like be a public park at night, that's when the issue might come in. So there's definitely that like a sort of variance there. But also, like I'm not sure how like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how relevant it is now, but the safety is one big priority there. So it's sort of a fundamental thing for human existence, but depending on how much you experienced in your own life, maybe it depends how much you can then also vocalize it. Yeah, thank you for the question.
All right, we have also multiple questions from the online participants. I will start with the first part. Who are these guidelines for? Can we ever design a metric for spatial experience? And wouldn't that always be subjective?
Yeah, let's start with the guidelines. I think it applies to all sorts of technology development that has to do with humans. Well, I'm not sure if there's like animal spatial experience. That's probably the thing that's been researched much, but like I would suggest that it helps at least to consider. Whereas to the metrics, I would suggest that these are mostly qualitative things. There are cultural differences in how we experience places, and for example, in the field of proxemics, it's been found that the distance you sort of make to other people, it varies from country to country. And sort of making these numerical, quantitative sort of descriptions of these features, it needs to be very carefully understood that who is being sort of quantified. And in that sense, I maybe wouldn't consider it to be a feature to be quantifiable. And was there also a third question there?
Yeah, but you already answered it.
All right, yeah. But, all right, thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. And we are already at the end for the session. So once again, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.